Welcome back. We're going to continue with the origins of the Cold War here. I want to mention just briefly the Yalta Conference in February of '45. This will be the last time that Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin will gather, the so-called Big Three. The Yalta has carried with it down through the decades certain political problems as well, especially domestically in this country. The Republicans have used it over the years as a stick with which to beat the Democrats. And again, I think this is a false controversy. I don't know if it's just stupidity or willful ignorance of the state of affairs there at Yalta. What Roosevelt wanted at Yalta was Stalin's participation in his new United Nations. He also wanted Stalin to bring the Red Army in against the Japanese after the European War was over. Roosevelt got both of those things. Stalin wanted domination of Eastern Europe, which the Red Army had already established. So the two most powerful men in the world essentially got what they wanted at Yalta. Again, the conservatives in the United States have used this as to punish the Democratic Party for the most part, with the accusation that we somehow gave up Eastern Europe as if it was ours to surrender. You'll see the same story repeated in China after the communist victory in '49. The Republicans will accuse the Democrats of giving up China as if it were ours to give. So it's kind of a false controversy, this business over Yalta. Some ideological origins of the Cold War. You got to remember, Hitler's dead in April of '45. The purpose of the Grand Alliance is coming to an end. That common enemy, which bound the United States, the Soviets, and the British together, is coming to an end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. So we have the reemergence of this competition between capitalism in the West and communism in the East. And then, of course, you have the Soviets sort of meddling in domestic politics in Europe, supporting leftist parties in Italy, for instance, and in France. This is worrisome to the United States. Of course, you also have the Soviets meddling in Greece and Turkey, or supporting leftist groups in Greece and Turkey. This will trigger the Truman Doctrine in 1947. Remember 1949, our long-term ally in China, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the nationalist forces, is finally defeated, driven to the island of Taiwan. Mao Zedong and the communist, the Red Army in China will take power, creating Red China, which we still enjoy today. Soviet puppet regimes are now popping up all over Eastern Europe. Stalin begins to he begins this rhetoric of permanent revolution again, this sort of threatening, old Bolshevik-sounding rhetoric that frightens the West with its class warfare. So you have these ideological sort of problems percolating at the end of the war, and now they're coming to a boil after the war is over. U.S. policies, the Truman Doctrine I just mentioned, the idea that we're going to contain Soviet aggression. And here's where the sort of false divisions between U.S. history, Western civilization, this class, and world history become evident. You can't simply divide these things. They begin to merge into one sort of global history with World War II and the aftermath. So the Truman Doctrine is an attempt to contain Soviet expansion, contain communist influence. The Marshall Plan. This, of course, is an attempt by the United States to rebuild the economies of Western Europe. Western Europe is in ruins after the war. What we essentially do here is offer the West Europeans and others credit with which to buy U.S. machinery, U.S. contractors, et cetera, to rebuild their countries. This is not altruism. This is a win-win situation. We're allowing the Europeans essentially a credit card that they can use in our store only. Stalin, of course, wants nothing to do with this. I think initially this aid was extended to the East European and the Soviets, and then was refused. Um, of course, NATO will be created here, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is still in existence. This is the military alliance led by the United States. In response, the Soviets will create the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet alliance that will extend through the length of the Cold War. Soviet actions that tended to exacerbate Cold War tensions early on, of course, Churchill described Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as laying down an iron curtain. And those nations east of that iron curtain were the captive nations lying within the Soviet sphere of influence. Of course, Stalin also attempted to squeeze the Allies with what's called the Berlin blockade, and then our response to it, the Berlin airlift. You have to remember that Germany was not only divided at the end of the war between that portion dominated by the Red Army, East Germany, and that portion dominated by the Western Allies, which would become the Federal Republic or West Germany. But the traditional capital of Germany, Berlin, is located, of course, in the eastern part of the country, in the Soviet zone in East Germany. So not only is Germany itself divided, but the capital is divided. There's an East Berlin dominated by the communists, and a West Berlin dominated by those Germans allied with the United States. Now, Stalin obviously can see that West Berlin is the most vulnerable part of the Western Alliance. Let's face it, the Red Army completely surrounds West Berlin and can squeeze it to death in a matter of minutes. The West has pledged to defend West Berlin. So this is a flashpoint. This is it's extremely vulnerable, yet highly symbolic. And we'll talk about Berlin later as we get deeper into the Cold War. But what I want to say here about the Berlin blockade is that Stalin cuts off all access to the city in 1947, and blocks the railroads, the highways, and sort of isolates West Berlin, demonstrating its vulnerability. What does the United States do in response? Truman orders the Air Force to supply it, to continually resupply West Berlin with food and medicine and fuel. And indeed, the U.S. Air Force does this quite successfully. This goes on for nearly a year, I think. And as I recall, Stalin finally just ended it. All it was doing was demonstrating our ability to supply an entire, or at least half a city, and demonstrating Russian futility in stopping it. So Stalin finally backed away from this challenge. Of course, the first Russian atomic weapon is tested in 1949. This is a grim surprise to the Western Allies. They thought they had a longer interval here where the West would be the only alliance with nuclear weapons. This ends in 1949. I already mentioned the Red Chinese, victorious in Mao Zedong, creating Red China, another obvious communist victory. And then in 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. Here, President Truman is going to rally the United Nations, send U.S. forces as well into South Korea to try to prevent South Korea from being entirely overrun. This is initially successful. Of course, General MacArthur, who had been commander of Allied ground forces in the Pacific during the war, has spent the intervening 5 years, from 45 to 50, as sort of the American proconsul of Japan. I believe he and his staff wrote the Japanese Constitution. He's brought in to command the troops in Korea, launches a daring behind the lines attack, or a flanking attack at Incheon, that essentially cuts off the North Korean armies, which are far south of that point. The North Korean armies now begin to evaporate as they flee northward to regain their lines of communication and lines of retreat. Had we stopped the war there, just go back to the status quo ante, things as they were before, Korea may have simply, the war itself would probably ended. But we took the initiative, MacArthur did, and drove north of the 38th parallel, where Korea had been divided. and drove all the way nearly to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. The Chinese threatened to come in, and indeed at Christmas in 1950 they do come in very large numbers, pushing the Allies back down into South Korea again. So you have this sort of endless yo-yo of a war in South Korea that people sour on very quickly. But this is part of containment. It's part of the Cold War. The Americans and the Russians never shoot at each other in the Cold War, but American and Russian client states do shoot at one another. Of course, the Soviets and the Chinese support North Vietnam in their attempt to drive the French out. After the Second World War, the French want to go back to their colonies in Southeast Asia, and they do. And the fight ensues again against the Vietnamese communists, and the French are finally thrown out for good in 1954 after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Of course, the United States will simply take the French place, and the long Vietnam War will continue. Political scientists will say the Cold War creates a bipolar world. I think I mentioned this. There's sort of two axes around which the countries of the world evolve. The Western axis, the NATO alliance, the Eastern axis, the Warsaw Pact. But then you can also have the sort of non-aligned countries emerging now in the Cold War as well. India and Egypt and other nations, South American countries that will refuse to join either the Western or Eastern alliance in the Cold War, giving them some leverage against the great powers. So just a couple of conclusions here. We'll talk, I haven't decided which lectures we'll do on the Cold War. We may talk about Vietnam, we may talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, because these are Cold War conflicts that involve Europe as well as having worldwide ramifications. And then, of course, we'll have to talk about the end of the Cold War as well. So I'll stop there with this long introduction, and see you next time. Thank you.